She sat there, her arms crossed in cold indifference, while the man she'd loved for 10 years handed her divorce papers across the table without looking at her. You were never worthy of this life. 7 words, enough to wash away an era. But what he didn't know, what no one in Chicago knew, was that the woman sitting silently in his old sweater was the only one standing between him and utterly destroying him. And tonight, she had decided to step aside. If you think this is just a story about a marriage, you're right. Please back to the end. Like and comment the city you're viewing from so I know how far this story has come. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, the kind of rain that didn't announce itself with thunder or lightning but simply arrived and refused to leave, pressing against every window in the city like something that wanted in. Chicago in November felt like a city slowly forgetting it was ever warm. The kitchen of the penthouse on the 42nd floor was dim. Elena had not turned on the overhead lights. She preferred the pale gray leak of the storm outside, the way it made everything look like an old photograph, like something already finished. She sat at the dining table in one of Damien's old Northwestern sweatshirts, the sleeves pulled down past her wrists, both hands wrapped around a ceramic mug she had stopped drinking from 20 minutes ago. The tea had gone cold. She didn't move to fix it. Damien came in from the hallway wearing the charcoal suit he'd put on that morning for a meeting he never told her about. He didn't look at her when he entered. He crossed to the far counter, opened a drawer, removed a manila envelope, and walked to the table. He set the envelope down, slid it toward her with 2 fingers like he was passing documents to an assistant. Inside was the paperwork. Elena looked at the envelope. She did not open it. She already knew what it was because Marcus, her father's attorney, had called her 4 days ago to tell her it was coming, and she had told him not to interfere. And Marcus had gone very quiet on the phone the way people went quiet when they understood something terrible was about to happen and had been instructed not to stop it. You were never enough for this life, Elena. Damien said it while turning back toward the counter. He didn't deliver it like a cruelty. He delivered it the way someone states a weather forecast. Factual, impersonal, already past the point of feeling anything about it. That was almost worse. If he had screamed at her, if he had cried, if his voice had cracked even slightly, she might have found something human in it to hold on to. But there was nothing. Just the flat sound of a man who had already moved on before the conversation began. Elena sat with the words. She let them settle into the room the way the rain settled, without drama, without asking permission. She did not cry. This was the part people would get wrong later, the ones who heard pieces of the story secondhand. They would assume she cried. People always assumed that about her, that she was fragile, that silence meant suffering, that stillness meant she was barely holding together. She had spent 10 years inside that assumption. She had, if she was honest with herself, helped build it, kept her voice soft, let him finish her sentences wrong without correcting him, smiled at dinner parties when investors' wives talked over her, let him believe the connections that funded his first real deal came through his own charm rather than a single phone call she made to a man who owed her family a favor he could never fully repay. She had made herself small, not because she was afraid, because she loved him. That was the part she kept returning to, even now, even sitting across from the envelope and the man who had stopped looking at her. She had genuinely loved him. Damien Cross at 32 had been brilliant and hungry and rough around the edges in a way that felt honest, a South Side kid who had clawed his way into business school through scholarships and sheer aggression, who laughed too loud at dinner and argued with taxi drivers about routes and read business books in the bathtub and believed with a kind of almost violent sincerity that he was going to build something real. She had loved that about him. She had loved the rawness of his ambition before it curdled into something uglier. She just hadn't predicted how far it would curdle. "Sign them when you're ready," Damien said. He was already moving toward the hallway. "Marcus has copies of everything. The condo downtown is yours. I'm not fighting over assets." He was being generous, he thought. She could hear that in his voice. The small pride of a man who believed he was handling something messy with grace. "Damien." Her voice stopped him at the hallway entrance. He turned. Elena looked at him for the first time since he'd entered the kitchen. She took her time with it. She looked at the suit and the careful haircut and the jaw that had gotten sharper as he'd gotten older, leaner, more polished. She looked at his hands. She had memorized those hands years ago. "Have dinner," she said. "Before you go, sit down. Have dinner." Something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly, more like discomfort. The discomfort of someone who has made a decision and wants the aftermath to proceed efficiently and is annoyed that the other party isn't cooperating with the efficient processing of the aftermath. Elena, I made lamb. It's in the oven. Sit down. He didn't sit down. He stood in the hallway entrance for 4 seconds, and she counted them, and then he said, I'll have something sent over for the next few weeks while you're figuring out. He paused, searching for the word, arrangements. He left. She heard the front door. She heard the elevator. She sat with the cold tea and the unsigned papers and the sound of rain against 42 stories of glass, and she thought, I gave you 10 years. Then she got up, turned off the oven, covered the lamb, and went to the bedroom to pack. She took one suitcase. She did not take the jewelry he'd bought her. She did not take the designer dresses from the Paris trip or the fur coat from the Christmas before last. She took clothes. She took her own books, the ones she'd had before him. She took 2 photographs, one of her mother, dead now 11 years, and one of her father standing in the garden of the estate on a spring afternoon that felt like it was from a different world entirely, which it was. She took the silver bracelet her mother had given her when she was 9 years old, and that she had never once taken off, not even in the decade she spent being Elena Cross. She zippered the suitcase and carried it to the foyer and called a number she knew by memory. The phone rang once. Miss Elena. The voice on the other end was low, accented, careful. It was Thomas, who had worked for her father since before she was born and who had, at her explicit request, stayed at a distance for 10 years while she lived her separate life. Thomas, she said, I'm ready to come home. A pause. Not surprise. More like the sound of something long held finally exhaling. The cars will be there in 40 minutes. She stood in the foyer and looked around the penthouse. The kitchen with its marble countertops and copper pots she had cooked in twice a week for a decade. The living room with the sectional sofa where Damien used to fall asleep during football games, and she would cover him with a blanket and work at the coffee table until midnight. The framed prints on the wall that she had chosen, every one of them, while he was traveling. She picked up the manila envelope from the dining table. She opened it. She read through the paperwork the way she read everything, carefully, fully, without skipping. She found the section regarding asset division. She found the section regarding the condo downtown that Damien had designated as hers, the gesture he was so proud of. She found the line that said, Elena Cross, née Vale. She looked at that name for a long time. Vale. The name she had given him. The small, clean, forgettable name of a woman from nowhere in particular. She set the papers back on the table, unsigned, and put on her coat. In the morning, Salvatore Luciano's motorcade moved through the city before the traffic could build. 3 black armored SUVs with plates that carried certain permissions embedded in their registration, the kind of permissions that caused patrol cars to redirect their attention elsewhere. They moved through the rain-slicked streets of the Gold Coast with the unhurried certainty of water finding its level. Elena sat in the middle vehicle between Thomas and a man named Gio, who had worked security since she was a teenager and who had once, when she was 14, quietly broken 3 fingers of a classmate who had been making her life miserable in ways she never told her father about. She had asked Gio to stop after the 2nd finger. He had apologized but finished the 3rd because, he explained, lessons need to be complete, Miss Elena, or they don't stick. She had thought about that philosophy many times in the years since. The Luciano estate sat behind iron gates on the lake, a property that from the outside looked like old money made respectable. Stone walls, manicured grounds, the kind of architecture that communicated longevity and silence. What it actually was a fortress that had been adapted across 3 generations to look like a home. Her grandfather had built it. Her father had fortified it. Elena had grown up inside it and spent 10 years trying to escape it. And now the gates opened ahead of her and she felt something she had not expected to feel, relief. Salvatore Luciano was waiting in the main hall. He was 71 years old and still looked like a man who could silence a room by entering it. Broad through the shoulders, white-haired now but thick still, with the face of someone who had learned to feel things deeply and show them selectively. When he saw Elena come through the door with her single suitcase and her mother's bracelet and the flat, careful expression she wore when she was refusing to let anything show, he did something she hadn't seen him do in years. He walked toward her. He put his arms around her. She stood inside the embrace for a moment before she returned it, And when she did, when she finally pressed her face against the shoulder of her father's coat, something cracked open in her chest that she couldn't name and didn't try to. She did not cry, but she held on longer than she intended. "Come," he said when he stepped back. "Eat something." "I cooked lamb." "I know, Thomas told me. Come, I had Rosa make—" "Papa?" She looked at him. "He didn't even stay for dinner." Salvatore Luciano looked at his daughter for a long moment. His face was very still. "No," he said finally. He wouldn't. They sat at the long kitchen table, not the formal dining room, the kitchen, which was the room in the estate where the family had always actually lived. And Rosa, who had been cooking for the Lucianos since before Elena was born, put plates in front of them without being asked, and then disappeared without needing to be dismissed. Elena ate. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until she started. "He doesn't know," her father said. "It wasn't a question." "He never asked." Salvatore nodded slowly. He picked up his wine, looked into the glass. "You protected him?" "Yes." "For 10 years?" "Yes." He set the glass down. "Elena, I never asked you to live that way." "I know. I asked you to be careful. I asked you to keep your name out of his professional world. I didn't ask you to—" "I know what you asked," she said. She wasn't sharp about it, just clear. "It wasn't for you, Papa. I was in love with him. I wanted to protect what I loved." Salvatore was quiet for a moment. "And now?" Elena put her fork down. She looked at the table, at the old wood grain she had traced with her fingers as a child sitting in this same kitchen eating meals that Rosa had made and listening to her father conduct business in the next room in voices kept deliberately low. "Now," she said, "I want to come home." Something shifted in her father's expression. Something careful and old and complicated. He had spent 30 years building an empire, and most of that time his deepest anxiety had been what happened to it when he was gone. He had no sons. He had Elena. And Elena had chosen love over inheritance, had chosen a quiet life over the weight of the family name. And he had let her because she was the only thing in the world he loved more than the empire itself. He looked at her now and saw something different in her face than what she'd carried out 10 years ago. "It's yours," he said simply. "It's been yours. I've just been keeping it warm." Elena picked her fork back up. "Not yet," she said. "There are things I need to do first." 3 weeks after Elena's return to the estate, Damien Cross gave his first major press interview since the divorce. He sat across from a financial journalist in the lobby of his downtown office building, a building whose lease, though he didn't know it, had been co-signed through a shell company connected to a Luciano subsidiary. And he talked about his company's growth trajectory and his plans for the next fiscal year and his gratitude for the extraordinary network he had built in Chicago's business community. He was photographed leaving the interview with Vanessa Hale on his arm. She was 28, the daughter of a real estate developer with connections on the North Shore, beautiful in the kind of way that required significant maintenance and knew it. She wore clothes that photographed well. She laughed at the right moments. She had introduced Damien to 3 hedge fund managers and a city alderman within the first month of their relationship. And Damien had interpreted this as evidence that he had finally found someone who matched his level. He did not think about Elena, or he told himself he didn't. There were moments, late at night after Vanessa had fallen asleep, when he lay awake in the new apartment he'd leased after the divorce, and the penthouse went back to the development company. Another detail he hadn't fully examined, the fact that the penthouse had simply reverted to the developer without the legal complications he'd braced for. And he thought about the kitchen, about the sound of her moving around in the mornings before he was fully awake, about the lamb she made on cold nights, about the way she used to sit across from him at the dining table working on her laptop, and he would look up sometimes and she'd already be looking at him with an expression he'd never quite been able to read. He told himself those thoughts were nostalgia, the ordinary grief of endings. He did not examine them too closely. Meanwhile, the meetings kept coming. The phone kept ringing with opportunities. The Whitmore Group, a mid-sized investment firm with deep Chicago roots, invited him to present for a potential partnership that could scale his company nationally. The invitation came through a mutual contact, or so it appeared, a man named Gerald Park, who moved in certain financial circles and had been, though Damien had no way of knowing this, a Luciano family associate for 15 years. Damien prepared for that meeting like his life depended on it, because in a way it did. His company, Cross Capital Ventures, was healthy on paper but had certain structural vulnerabilities that required continuous infusions of investor confidence to stay solvent. The kind of vulnerabilities that could become catastrophic overnight if the right parties decided to notice them. He had been carrying this anxiety for years, a low hum of precariousness beneath the success, the knowledge that any significant disruption to his investor relationships could trigger a cascade he wouldn't recover from. He didn't know that precariousness was not accidental. He didn't know it had been installed very carefully and over many years by the woman who had slept beside him every night for a decade, not out of cruelty. She hadn't planned it that way. It had simply been the nature of how she helped him, threading her family's influence through his business structure so quietly, so completely, that the architecture of his success and the architecture of her protection had become indistinguishable. Removing her support would not feel like pulling a rug out. It would feel like the load-bearing walls of a building slowly deciding they were done. Elena watched the Whitmore meeting happen from a report Thomas placed on her desk the following morning. She sat in her office on the estate, a room her father had not used much, had kept spare for her, white walls and a long window overlooking the garden, and she read through the summary with the same careful attention she gave everything. Damien had performed well, apparently. Gerald had been enthusiastic. The deal was moving forward. She set the report down. She thought about the man who had slid those papers across the table without looking at her. She thought about you were never enough for this life. She thought about the lamb cooling in the oven. Then she picked up her phone and called Marcus. "The Whitmore Partnership," she said. "Yes, Miss Elena." "Let it proceed." A pause. "Of course." "For now," she said. Marcus understood. He always understood. That was what made him useful. Elena set the phone down and looked out the window at the estate garden, bare in November. The old trees stripped down to their structure, all the temporary things gone, and only the permanent things remaining. She thought about her father's words at dinner. "The empire's yours. It's been yours." She was not ready to think about that yet. There were smaller things first. There were 10 years of careful, anonymous protection to slowly, surgically, completely withdraw. Not in anger. She was past anger. Anger was loud and exhausting and imprecise. She was thinking in the language her father had always spoken, the language she had spent a decade pretending not to know. Patience, precision, the long game. She picked up a different file from the desk. This one relating to the Avalon Foundation Gala scheduled for February, the most significant social event on Chicago's private calendar. An event she had attended once, years ago, on Damien's arm, wearing a dress he'd picked out and answering to a name she'd borrowed and keeping her eyes carefully downcast when certain guests greeted her with the particular deference reserved for the Luciano name. She had spent 10 years making herself invisible. February felt like the right time to stop. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, standing at the window of her father's office with the winter garden below her and the whole frozen city beyond the walls, Elena Luciano felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt like herself. And somewhere across Chicago, in an apartment filled with the smell of a woman's perfume and the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally arrived, Damien cross-checked his phone for messages, found 3 from investors confirming upcoming meetings, smiled to himself in the dark, and had absolutely no idea what was coming. Phần 2 sẽ đưa Damien đến đỉnh cao và đặt viên gạch đầu tiên cho sự sụp đổ của anh ta tại đêm ra tiệc Avalon, nơi Elena Luciano bước vào ánh đèn lần đầu tiên sau 10 năm. December moved through Chicago like a slow fever. Not dramatic enough to shut anything down, just persistent enough to make everything feel worse than it was. The kind of cold that found the gap between your collar and your jaw and stayed there. The kind of dark that arrived at 4 in the afternoon and made the whole city feel like it was already closing up for good. Damien Cross did not notice the cold. He had a driver now. The car was a black Mercedes S-Class that he leased through the company, a decision he'd run through his CFO, a sharp-eyed woman named Priya who had flagged it as a discretionary expense they could not technically justify at current margins. Damien had overruled her without a meeting. That was new. 6 months ago, he would have argued the numbers with her, would have sat across the table and gone line by line. Now he just made calls. That was also new. The Whitmore partnership closed on a Tuesday. $38 million in committed capital, with an option to extend to 60 within 18 months. Gerald Park had called him personally to congratulate him, and Damien had accepted the congratulations with the practiced ease of a man trying to appear accustomed to good news. That night he took Vanessa to a dinner at Sepia, a reservation that had appeared in his inbox that morning, offered by the restaurant's events coordinator as a courtesy gesture for valued guests, which Damien accepted without asking who had arranged it or why a restaurant he'd never specifically patronized considered him valued. Vanessa wore red. She was good at entrances. She had the instinct for it, the slight pause at the threshold, the lifted chin, the way she arranged her body to catch light. Damien watched people watch her and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who believed the thing being admired was an extension of his own judgment. "Gerald called you personally," Vanessa said over the appetizers. Not a question. She'd been in the room when it happened, close enough to hear the tone, if not the words. "He did." "That's not standard." She picked up her wine. "Gerald Park doesn't call personally. He has people." "Maybe I'm the kind of deal that warrants personal." She looked at him over the rim of her glass with an expression he couldn't quite place, something careful. "Maybe," she said. He didn't ask what she meant. He should have. Across town, in a coroner office on the 14th floor of a building on Michigan Avenue, whose ownership was distributed across 4 LLCs in a way that would take a forensic accountant 2 weeks to untangle, Marcus Lane sat across from a man named Victor Chen and discussed the Whitmore Group's current exposure in the Chicago commercial real estate sector. The conversation was methodical and quiet and took 40 minutes, at the end of which Victor Chen left with a handshake and a folder he carried pressed against his chest like it contained something fragile, which it did. Thomas knocked on the office doorframe when Chen was gone. "She wants an update." Marcus picked up his phone. Elena was in the estate library when the call came. She had converted the room in the 3 weeks since her return, had taken the space her father used for receiving certain guests, and shifted it into something functional. 2 laptops, a standing desk she'd ordered herself, file boxes organized in a system only she fully understood, a whiteboard along the far wall covered in names and lines and numbers written in her neat, small hand. Her father had stood in the doorway on the 3rd day and looked at the whiteboard for a long time without speaking. "The Whitmore capital is in," she said when Marcus connected, "as of this afternoon." And Chen? Understood completely. Good. She was standing at the whiteboard, a marker uncapped in her hand. "Give it 90 days. Let him settle in. Let him believe in it." "And the audit exposure?" Elena looked at the whiteboard, at the name in the upper right corner, boxed in, with 3 lines running out from it. "Not yet," she said. "That's a February conversation." She capped the marker. "How is he?" Marcus paused. "He seems well, confident." "Comfortable?" "Very." Elena set the marker on the tray at the bottom of the whiteboard. "Good," she said again, and this time it meant something different. The holiday season carried Damien Cross to heights he had not predicted and would not have believed 6 months prior. December brought an invitation to the Harrington Club's annual private dinner, a gathering of roughly 40 men and women who collectively managed more capital than most mid-sized countries, where Damien sat 3 seats from a former Treasury official and discussed infrastructure investment with the focus and fluency of someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this room. Because he had. That much was genuinely his. He was smart. That was the thing people missed when they later told the story of Damien Cross, the thing that got edited out, in the version where he was simply a fool who didn't know what he had. He was genuinely intelligent, genuinely driven, had real instincts for business, and real analytical capability. If you had transplanted him out of Chicago, away from the Luciano shadow he didn't know he was standing in, given him a neutral environment and a fair starting point, he might have built something real. But he hadn't been transplanted. He'd been cultivated, and he'd confused the greenhouse for the outdoors. Vanessa noticed things. That was what made her dangerous in the way beautiful, well-connected women were sometimes dangerous, not through malice, but through observation. She noticed that Damien's meetings produced results at a rate that didn't track with his actual leverage. She noticed that certain calls came in from people who had no obvious prior relationship with him and yet spoke with the ease of long familiarity. She noticed, at the Harrington dinner, That a woman named Constance Howe, who managed a family office that nobody discussed openly and everybody courted quietly, had greeted Damien with a warmth that seemed borrowed from somewhere else. Afterward in the car, she said, "Constance Howe likes you. We had a good conversation." She doesn't have good conversations with people she doesn't already know. Vanessa was looking out the window. Her reflection was very still. She's careful. Old money careful. Maybe she vetted me. Maybe. A beat. Through who? Damien looked at her. What? Who would she have gone through to vet you? Vanessa turned from the window. Her face was pleasant, genuinely curious, which was sometimes more unsettling than direct challenge. You don't have anyone in that tier, not naturally. Your network is solid, but it's new money and finance. Constance Howe is 3 generations of closed doors. She tilted her head slightly. So who vouched for you? Maybe I vouch for myself. Vanessa smiled and turned back to the window and did not say anything else for the rest of the drive. And the silence was the kind that had a shape. That night, Damien lay awake in the apartment and thought about Constance Howe and the way she'd leaned in slightly when they were talking. The particular quality of attention she'd paid him, the kind of attention you gave to someone whose name you already knew in a certain context. He thought about Gerald Park and the personal call. He thought about 3 other moments from the past 4 months that he had, at the time, attributed to his own growing stature. He thought about Elena. He did not let the thought finish. He turned over, pulled the sheet up, and in 10 minutes he was asleep because Damien Cross had the gift of convincing himself of things quickly. And tonight, he had convinced himself it was nothing. January arrived. The city went gray and mean. Ice formed on the river and the wind off the lake became something you had to physically fight on certain corners, leaning into it with your whole body, a negotiation rather than a walk. The kind of weather that made Chicago feel like it was testing you personally. Damien was in the office by 7 most mornings now. Priya had stopped flagging discretionary expenses. The company had added 3 new staff in the past 6 weeks and was running 2 concurrent due diligence processes on acquisition targets that, 12 months ago, would have been so far above Cross Capital's weight class, they wouldn't have known the names. He was moving fast. He liked moving fast. Speed felt like proof. He called his mother on a Sunday, the way he did most Sundays. She still lived in Bridgeport, same house he'd grown up in, had refused every offer he'd made to move her somewhere bigger. She asked about work. He told her things were extraordinary. She said she was glad and asked if he was eating. He said yes. She asked about Elena. She always asked about Elena. Ma, I'm just asking. We're done. We've been done. I liked her. I know you liked her. She came to visit me. Did you know that? After. His mother's voice went careful. She came and brought those rolls I like from the bakery on Halstead and sat with me for 2 hours and didn't say one bad word about you. Not one. Damien was quiet. She asked how you were, his mother said. How you were. I thought that was, Ma, I have to go. He hung up and sat with the phone in his hand in the kitchen of the apartment and looked at the opposite wall for a while. Then he put the phone down and went back to the acquisition report on his laptop and did not think about Elena Vale or bakeries on Halstead or the way a woman could pack one suitcase and leave and not say a single bad word. And somehow that was worse than anything else she could have done. The invitation to the Avalon Foundation Gala arrived on a Wednesday in the 2nd week of January. Thick cream envelope, hand addressed. The Avalon was the kind of event that people in Chicago's serious money circles did not discuss publicly, in the way that the most significant things in any city were never publicly discussed. It was held every February in the Grand Ballroom of the Meridian Hotel, and its guest list was compiled by a committee that included foundations, family offices, and certain private civic organizations whose actual function was not reflected in their names. Receiving an invitation meant something. It meant you had crossed a threshold. Damien held the envelope for a long time. Then he called Vanessa. I got the Avalon invite. A beat of silence. Show me. She was there in 40 minutes. She looked at the envelope the way you looked at something that required careful handling. She read the card inside once, then again. This doesn't come through normal channels, she said. I know. My father's been trying to get on this list for 8 years. She set the card down on the kitchen counter. He knows every committee member personally. Vanessa, I'm not complaining. She looked at him. Her eyes were very direct. I'm telling you something is happening with your positioning that I don't understand, and I think you should understand it before you walk into a room like the Avalon. Damien leaned against the counter. He crossed his arms. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting you figure out who's been building the architecture of your last 6 months. She said it cleanly, without heat. Because it isn't you, not entirely. You're good, Damien, but you're not Avalon invitation out of nowhere good. Not yet. The room was quiet for a moment. And when I find out, he said, then you decide what to do about it. She picked up her bag. But you should know before February. She left, and Damien stood in the kitchen with the cream envelope on the counter and the slowly hardening understanding that the question she'd asked was one he had been deliberately not asking for months, and that avoiding a question didn't make it go away. It just let it grow. He poured a glass of water, drank it standing at the sink, looking out the window at the gray January street below. He thought about every meeting, every call, every investor who had come through. He thought about the Whitmore partnership and Gerald Park and Constance Howe, and the restaurant reservation he'd never quite examined, and the penthouse that had reverted to the developer without legal complication. And he thought about the common thread he had been pressing out of his mind for months, with the sustained effort of a man pressing a wound closed with his bare hand. He thought, Elena. And this time he let the thought finish. He called his attorney, a man named Brad Hollis, who handled his corporate work and had, 2 years ago, helped structure a deal that required navigating certain Chicago municipal permitting processes with unusual speed. The Whitmore Group, he said when Brad picked up. I need to know the actual beneficial ownership. A pause. Damien, that's... I know what it is. Do it quietly. And Brad, the Harrington Club introduction. Gerald Park. I need to know who Park's principal relationships are, going back 5 years. Another pause. Longer this time. How deep do you want to go? Damien looked out the window, ice on the glass from last night. Deep enough. The research took 2 weeks. Brad used a firm he trusted, people who were good at following corporate structures through the nested shells and nominee arrangements that serious Chicago money used to move without leaving fingerprints. It was not simple work. It was the kind of work that required patience and a willingness to follow threads that seemed to dead end and then didn't. Brad delivered the results in person. He drove to Damien's office on a Thursday morning and sat across the desk and put a folder down and did not immediately open it. You sure about this? Brad said. Open it. Brad opened it. Damien read. He read slowly, the way he read things that mattered, going over each page twice before moving on. He was quiet throughout. His face did not move much. His breathing stayed even, or he kept it even, which was not the same thing. The Whitmore Group's beneficial ownership ran through 3 intermediate entities before landing, partially, in a holding company registered in Delaware, whose registered agent had the same address as a legal firm that represented, among other clients, the Luciano Family Trust. Gerald Park had, for 13 years, managed certain private financial arrangements on behalf of Salvatore Luciano. Constance Howe's family office had co-invested with Luciano-connected entities no fewer than 7 times in the past decade. The Harrington Club dinner invitation had been extended, according to Brad's research, at the request of a board member who had attended a charity function at the Luciano estate 6 weeks prior. And the Avalon Foundation, the organization whose gala Damien was now preparing to attend as a guest of honor, counted among its founding donors a charitable trust established in the name of Maria Luciano, Elena's mother, 20 years ago. Damien sat back in his chair. The room was very quiet. Brad was watching him with the expression of a man who had known his client a long time and was not certain what version of him was going to speak next. 10 years, Damien said. Damien, 10 years. He was looking at the folder, not at Brad. She was doing this for 10 years. It appears, and I thought it was me. He laughed. It was not a good sound, short and sharp and carrying something close to physical pain. I thought I was building this. You built plenty, your own analytical work, your management. Brad. Damien's voice went flat. Stop. Brad stopped. Damien stood up from the desk. He walked to the window. The city was below him in the pale January light, all glass and steel and distance. He had stood at this window many times and felt the specific satisfaction of looking down at a place he was climbing, the view as evidence of progress. He stood there now and felt the floor shift under $38 million and a collection of meetings and introductions and approvals that had felt like his own hands building something and had apparently, at least in part, been something else entirely. He thought about the divorce papers, the way she hadn't signed them that night, the way she'd said have dinner and he'd walked out. He thought about you were never enough for this life. His own words, coming back at him now with a different kind of weight. She's going to be at the Avalon, he said. He didn't know why he was certain. He just was. Brad was quiet. February, Damien said. She's going to be there. He turned from the window. His face had settled into something he didn't entirely recognize in himself. Not anger, not exactly. More like the particular nausea of a man who had been losing a game for a very long time without knowing he was playing. I'm still going, he said. Brad looked at him. Damien, I'm going. He picked up the folder, closed it. And I'm going to talk to her. Brad left without arguing, which was its own kind of verdict. The office went quiet. Damien sat back down at his desk and opened his laptop and stared at the screen without seeing it, and thought about what he was going to say to a woman who had apparently been the invisible architecture of the last decade of his life, and who had, without any fanfare or announcement or even a change of expression, decided to stop. He did not sleep well that night, or the night after. Vanessa noticed. She noticed everything. She was at the apartment on Friday evening, and she watched him move through the kitchen, making coffee he didn't drink, watched him sit down and stand up twice, watched him look at his phone and set it face down. And finally she said, "You found something." He looked at her. "I can tell," she said. "You've been somewhere else for 3 days." He thought about telling her. He almost did. Then he thought about what she'd said in this same kitchen 2 weeks ago. Figure out who's been building the architecture of your last 6 months. And he thought about the fact that Vanessa Hale's own access to certain circles had been part of the picture he was now reassembling. And he thought about how certain access worked, who gave it, and why. And he thought about a conversation he now recalled differently than he had at the time. Vanessa at a party in October saying, "I'd love to introduce you to Gerald. He's brilliant." And Gerald Park turning toward Damien with the ease of a man who had been briefed. He looked at Vanessa. "It's nothing," he said. "Work stuff." She held his gaze for a moment. She was very good at that, holding a look without it becoming a confrontation, keeping her face composed and her eyes reading. Then she nodded slowly and picked up her wine and changed the subject and did not bring it up again. But something had shifted in the room. Both of them felt it, and neither of them named it, and the not naming of it sat between them for the rest of the evening like a third presence at the table. 3 weeks later, on the night of the Avalon Foundation Gala, Damien Cross put on the custom tuxedo he'd had made in November and stood in front of the bathroom mirror in the apartment and looked at himself for a long time. He looked like the man he'd always been trying to become. That was the problem. He looked like it so completely that he couldn't tell anymore where the becoming had actually happened. He went alone. He had told Vanessa it was a business event, better without a +1, he'd explain later. She had accepted this without visible reaction, which told him she'd already understood something he hadn't yet fully articulated. The Meridian's grand ballroom was everything the envelope had promised. The kind of room that communicated its own importance simply through proportion, high ceilings, and the weight of chandeliers and the particular acoustics of serious money and formal dress. Damien knew perhaps a quarter of the faces. The rest were the next tier up. The people he was still in the process of reaching, the ones whose names appeared in the kind of news coverage that was measured in column inches rather than clicks. He got a drink. He worked the room the way he knew how to work rooms. Direct, focused, listening slightly more than talking, the technique he'd learned early and refined over 10 years. He shook hands with a former senator. He spoke briefly with the director of a foundation he'd been trying to connect with for 2 quarters. He was doing well. He was almost calm. Then the ballroom doors opened. He didn't immediately understand why the room changed. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in attention, the way conversation lost a half beat of momentum across multiple simultaneous clusters, heads turning, not dramatically, but definitely. The kind of shift a room makes when something enters it that reorganizes the room's understanding of its own hierarchy. He turned. Elena stood at the entrance. Black silk that moved when she moved and stopped when she stopped. Diamonds at her ears and throat that caught the chandelier light and threw it back cold and precise. Her hair was up, Her posture was the posture of someone who had made a decision about how to occupy space and had made it completely. Behind her, at a distance that was formal enough to be deniable and close enough to be unmistakable, stood two men in tailored suits with the particular stillness of people trained to look relaxed while being anything but. But what Damien noticed, what stopped his breathing for a full second, was not the dress or the diamonds or the men behind her. It was the room. Every serious person in the Avalon Foundation Gala greeted Elena Luciano with the specific deference reserved for people who did not need the room but had chosen to grace it. The former senator he'd spoken to 10 minutes ago crossed the floor toward her. Constance Howe turned from her conversation mid-sentence. The foundation director, who had just shaken Damien's hand, was suddenly oriented entirely toward the doorway. And Elena moved through it all the way water moved, without forcing anything, without performing anything, with the absolute ease of someone who had decided they were done being invisible and found, unsurprisingly, that the world already knew exactly who they were. She had not looked at him yet. He stood with his drink in his hand and felt the specific horror of clarity arriving too late, the way you understood a chess move 3 turns after it had been played, when the board had already reorganized itself around a new reality. Every investor, every introduction, every approval, every door that had swung open with what felt like his own momentum. Then she turned, slowly, across the width of the ballroom, and her eyes found him with a precision that told him it was not accidental, that she had known exactly where he was standing from the moment she walked in, and she looked at him the way you looked at something you had already finished grieving. Not with anger, not with pain, with a calm so complete it felt like a verdict. Damien Cross stood in the grandest room he had ever earned entry to and understood in that moment with full and terrible clarity that the entry itself had never been entirely his to earn and that the woman across the ballroom had not come here tonight to confront him. She had come to let him finally see the whole board. And across the room, Elena held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, enough to be certain he understood. And then she turned away, and a man Damien had been trying to meet for 2 years stepped forward to take her hand, and she smiled, and the smile was genuine and warm and had absolutely nothing in it for Damien Cross at all. He set his drink down on a passing tray. His hand was not entirely steady. Phần 3 sẽ là đêm đối đầu trực tiếp, khi Damien phá vỡ giao thức, tìm cách tiếp cận Elena trong chính ngôi nhà của cha cô và nghe những lời nói sẽ xé toạc mọi ảo tưởng cuối cùng anh ta còn giữ lại. He stood at the edge of the ballroom for 11 minutes after Elena turned away. He counted them. Not deliberately, time simply became measurable in a way it hadn't been before, each minute a unit of something he was enduring rather than spending. Around him, the gala continued its orchestrated circulation, glasses lifted and lowered, laughter arriving on cue. The low, persistent music of a string quartet doing what string quartets did at these events, providing a texture of civilization over transactions that had nothing to do with civilization. Damien watched Elena move through the room. He watched the way people came to her rather than the reverse. He watched the body language of people he had spent months trying to impress, the slight forward lean, the sustained eye contact, the particular quality of attention that powerful people gave only to other powerful people or to people they were afraid of. And he watched all of it orient toward a woman he had last seen sitting in a dim kitchen in one of his old sweatshirts with a cup of cold tea. The distance between those two images was not calculable. Gerald Park passed within 10 feet of him. Damien watched Park's trajectory shift almost imperceptibly toward Elena's orbit, the way a satellite adjusted its path around the body with the most gravitational pull. Park had called him personally to congratulate him on the Whitmore deal. Park had done that while managing Salvatore Luciano's private financial arrangements for 13 years. Damien thought about the tone of that call, the warmth in it, and now he understood the warmth. It wasn't for him. It was the warmth of a man who had successfully executed an instruction and was pleased with the result. He needed air. He found a corridor off the main ballroom that ran toward the building's east wing, a service passage dressed up with marble floors and wall sconces for the occasion. He walked until the music became muffled and the density of bodies thinned, and he was standing in a stretch of quiet hallway with his back against the wall and his drink, a fresh one he'd taken from a passing tray without thinking, held loosely in one hand. His reflection showed in a decorative mirror on the opposite wall. Custom tuxedo. Pocket square folded correctly. The carefully assembled exterior of a man who belonged. He looked at his reflection for a long time. Then he took out his phone and called Brad. Brad picked up on the third ring, groggy, the TV audible in the background. It's 10:30. She's here. A pause. The TV went muffled. At the Avalon? Yes. Damien. Brad's voice went careful. Whatever you're thinking, I need to know where the Luciano Winter charity function is, the one in February. I need access. You need to go home. Brad, listen to me. Brad's voice dropped the way it dropped when he was being a lawyer rather than a friend, which Damien had learned to distinguish years ago. The Luciano family is not a conversation you walk into because you're having a bad night. That's not how this works. I need to talk to her. You need to go home, sleep on this, and call me in the morning when you're... Damien hung up. He stood in the corridor and breathed and thought about Elena's face across the ballroom, the 3 seconds of eye contact, the way it had contained exactly nothing for him. He thought about his mother's voice on the phone. She came and brought those rolls I like and sat with me for 2 hours and didn't say one bad word about you. He thought about 10 years. He went back into this ballroom. He looked for Elena. She was near the far end, in conversation with 2 men he didn't recognize and a woman whose name he'd seen on foundation letterhead. He watched the conversation, and it was animated on all sides. Elena laughing at something one of the men said, her hand touching the other man's arm briefly in the way that meant genuine warmth rather than performance. She was not performing anything. That was the thing he kept returning to. Everything she was doing in this room was real, and everything he had assumed about her for 10 years had been a story he'd told himself because the truth required looking at her differently, and looking at her differently would have required looking at himself differently. And Damien Cross, at 32 and 35 and 39, had not been ready to do that. He crossed the room toward her. He had covered perhaps a third of the distance when one of the men in tailored suits appeared beside him. Not in front of him. Beside him. As if the man had simply been standing nearby and happened to match Damien's pace. Mr. Cross? The voice was low and had no particular affect. The man was broad, maybe 45, with a face that was pleasant in the specific way of faces trained to reveal nothing. Let me suggest a different direction. Damien kept walking. I just want to speak with her. I understand. The man continued matching his pace, close enough that they were essentially walking together. And I'm suggesting a different direction. Are you threatening me? No, sir. Perfectly even. I'm making a suggestion. Damien stopped. The man stopped with him. They were standing in the middle of the ballroom floor, surrounded by people who were not looking at them. And the not looking had a quality of intention, the practiced incuriosity of people who understood when something was happening that they should not see. Damien looked across the remaining distance at Elena. She had not turned. She was still in her conversation, still laughing at something, and there was something about the precision of that, the fact that she was not watching him, not tracking whether her suggestion had been enforced, that communicated more than any confrontation could have. She didn't need to watch. She already knew. He turned and walked toward the exit. The man in the tailored suit did not follow. He didn't need to. Damien Cross left the Avalon Foundation Gala at 10:47 and stood outside in the February cold on the sidewalk in front of the Meridian Hotel, with the city lit up around him and the knowledge that something he had been delaying for months had arrived and was not going away. He did not go home. He drove to a bar he used to go to in his 20s, a place on the near north side that was not the kind of bar a man in a custom tuxedo walked into, which was why he chose it. He sat at the end of the counter and had 2 drinks and thought about the folder Brad had put on his desk, and thought about Gerald Park, and thought about Elena in black silk with her hair up, and the diamonds that threw cold light, and the way every significant person in the city had turned toward her like she was the thing they had all been actually waiting for. The bartender brought a 3rd drink without being asked. Damien looked at it. He thought about something Brad had said during a deal negotiation 2 years ago, something Damien had filed away and not thought about since. The most dangerous position in any negotiation is the one where you don't know what leverage you're actually operating on. He had understood it at the time as a practical principle. He understood it now as something that had been personally true of his entire professional life and possibly his marriage. He left the 3rd drink untouched and went home. The next 3 weeks were the slowest of his recent life. The company continued to function. The Whitmore capital was deployed across 2 positions that Priya managed with her usual precision. Meetings happened. Calls were returned. The machinery moved. But Damien had stopped believing in the machinery. He began doing something he had not done in years. He looked at things carefully. He pulled the company's investor relationship history and traced each connection to its origin. He reviewed every major deal in the past 4 years and built a timeline of the introductions that enabled them. He sat alone in the office for 3 consecutive nights working through documentation with the methodical grimness of a man auditing his own life. What he found confirmed and deepened everything Brad's research had shown. The architecture of his success was real in the way a house built on someone else's land was real. The house existed, the craftsmanship was genuine, but the ground beneath it belonged to someone else. And if that someone decided to revoke the foundation, the craft didn't matter. He thought about calling Elena. He took out his phone multiple times and looked at the number he still had for her, the number he had not deleted and had not examined his own reasons for not deleting. He didn't call. He didn't know what he would say. Thank you seemed obscene. I'm sorry seemed insufficient. I need you to stop seemed like a request he had no right to make to someone he'd told was never enough. He went back to work. He made a decision, or the beginning of a decision, that he would find his own path out, that he would untangle the Luciano infrastructure from his company and build something that was genuinely his, that he would handle this the way he had handled the original climb before he understood the climb had been assisted. He was still constructing this plan in his head when the federal notification arrived on a Thursday in early March. Priya called him at 7 in the morning, which was the call before which he had been a person who believed in his plan, and after which he was not. Her voice was controlled in the way of someone who was holding something with both hands to prevent it from shaking. "We have a notification," she said, "from the SEC." Damien was still in bed. He sat up. "Specify. Formal inquiry. Cross Capital Ventures and 3 named subsidiaries." A beat. "It came through the firm's external counsel. They called me before you because, Damien, it's broad. The scope is broad." "How broad?" "It references transactions going back 4 years." Another beat, and this one was longer, had more weight in it. "It specifically names the Whitmore partnership." He was out of bed, standing, before she finished the sentence. "Who filed it?" "The notification doesn't—" "Priya, who filed it?" "I don't know yet." Her voice was very carefully even. But whoever compiled the supporting documentation knew the company's internal structure. Specifically. A pause. From the inside. He hung up. He called Brad. Brad answered on the first ring, which meant Brad had already been called. "I'm on my way," Brad said. They sat in Damien's office for 4 hours. Brad had brought 2 associates from the firm, and they spread documentation across the conference table and worked through the SEC notification with the grim efficiency of doctors triaging. The inquiry was, as Priya had said, broad. It touched on capital sourcing, investor representations, certain fee structures in the Whitmore deal that had been structured in a way that was arguably compliant and arguably not, depending on how aggressively an examiner chose to read them. "This can be managed," Brad said around hour 3. He said it with conviction that was slightly too careful to be genuine conviction. "Brad, it can be, is this them?" Brad set down the document he was holding. He looked at Damien across the conference table with the expression of a man who had known his client a very long time and was now calculating how honest to be. "The sourcing of the supporting documentation," Brad said slowly. "Whoever gave this to the SEC had access to internal communications from 18 months ago, pre-Whitmore structuring discussions." He paused. "That pool of people is small." "How small?" "You, me, Priya, and whoever your investors were communicating with at the time." Brad looked at him. "Given what we found about the Whitmore beneficial ownership, the Luciano-connected entities, they had access to the internal communications," Damien said, "because they were the investors. They were in the room." Brad said nothing. "They filed this," Damien said. "I can't confirm—" "Brad?" Damien's voice had gone very flat. "Don't manage me right now. Tell me what you think." Brad was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that someone with access to your company's internal deal structure and a motivation to create regulatory exposure chose a very precise moment to do so." He looked at the documents on the table. The Whitmore deal is the centerpiece of your current investor confidence. An SEC inquiry into that specific partnership at this specific stage of your expansion creates a particular kind of pressure. It kills the expansion. It stalls it significantly. Brad folded his hands. Any new investor will wait for resolution. Current investors will get nervous. The Whitmore principals themselves may choose to withdraw pending inquiry, which would trigger the liquidity clause, Damien said. He knew his own documents. He had known, when the clause was drafted, that it was aggressive. He had not known at the time that the party on the other side of that clause had reasons beyond standard risk management to want it there. He sat back in his chair. The office windows were behind him, the city below them, the same view he had stood at months ago when Brad first brought him the folder about beneficial ownership and the Luciano connections. He had stood there and felt the floor shift and told himself he would find his way out. The floor had just shifted again. Further, he sent everyone home at 6. He sat alone in the office until 8. He was not working. He was doing the thing he had not fully done before, the thing he had been managing around for months. He was sitting with the full shape of it, not a piece at a time, but all of it together. The marriage, the protection he hadn't known he was under, the divorce, and the words he had said, and the way she had sat in the dim kitchen without responding, the silence he had mistaken for weakness, the 10 years of invisible architecture, the Avalon, the SEC filing that had arrived with the precision of something very carefully aimed. He was not angry, or he was past angry, had moved through it somewhere in hour 2 of the conference room session and come out the other side into something colder and more honest. He had said words to a person, and those words had been, "You were never enough for this life." And the person he'd said them to had apparently been the primary reason his life had been as good as it was. He thought, I did this, not as absolution, not as performance of regret, just as the flat, factual recognition of a man who had been careful about facts his whole professional life and was applying that care, finally, to himself. He picked up his phone. He scrolled to a number he had found through a contact 2 weeks ago, after the Avalon, a number he had stored without labeling because labeling it would have made it too real. He stared at the number for a while. Then he called Thomas. Thomas answered immediately, which told Damien that Thomas had been told to answer if Damien called, which told him something about how this was being managed on the other side. Mr. Cross, I need to see her. A pause. Miss Elena's schedule. Thomas. He stopped. He breathed. He thought about how to say the thing that needed to be said without it sounding like a negotiation or a plea or a threat. And the problem was that it was all 3 of those things, and he was too exhausted to dress it differently. Please, he said. Another pause. Longer. I'll convey the request, Thomas said. The call lasted 14 seconds. Damien sat with the phone in his hand. Outside, Chicago was dark and cold, and did not care about any of it. The response came the next morning, not from Thomas, from Marcus, which told him the response had been considered carefully and that what he was being offered was not an informal conversation, but something with a specific structure that he was being permitted to enter on someone else's terms. The Luciano Winter charity event was 2 weeks out. He was not on the guest list. He would never be on the guest list through normal channels. But Marcus's message indicated, with the particular indirection of a man who communicated through implication professionally, that the estate gates would not be closed to him on that evening if he arrived at 11, when the formal proceedings would be concluding, and that he should come alone. He read the message twice. Then he understood that he was being allowed to come not because Elena wanted to see him, but because she had decided the conversation they hadn't finished deserved to be finished, and that this was not mercy. It was completion. She was offering him the ending of something, not the reopening of it, and he needed to walk in knowing the difference. The 2 weeks were the worst of the professional crisis. The Whitmore principals did not officially withdraw, but they went quiet in the specific way that communicated everything without requiring documentation. 2 other investors called to check in with the particular tone of people checking the temperature of something they were considering exiting. Priya managed the company's daily operations with grim competence, and Damien let her, because the company needed her steadiness more than it needed his presence. Vanessa called twice. He returned 1 call briefly. She was not stupid. She had read the public filings. The SEC inquiry had leaked in a way that these things leaked, quiet at first and then faster. And she asked careful questions that were actually one question, which was whether the man she had been with for the past year was someone worth the current weather or someone she should move away from before the weather got worse. He answered her carefully, and she listened carefully, and at the end of the conversation, she said she needed a few days to think, which was the way someone began an ending when they were too considerate to do it quickly. He told her he understood. He did. The night of the charity event arrived cold and clear, the kind of Chicago winter night where the lake was audible from a distance, a low, constant sound like the city breathing. Damien drove himself. He had sent the driver home earlier in the week, one of several expenses he had quietly pulled back, less for the money than for the need to do things with his own hands again. He came through the gates of the Luciano estate at 11:03. The formal event was winding down. Guests were dispersing through the main entrance, cars moving in a line through the gate, and Damien moved against this flow, arriving while others were leaving, which felt accurate in a way he didn't examine too closely. A man he didn't recognize met him inside the secondary entrance and walked him through a back corridor and through a pair of doors and into a room adjacent to the grand hall where the event had been. The room was a sitting room off the main corridor, high-ceilinged, a fire that had been burning for hours and was now ember-level, warm and dim, oil paintings on the walls, a sideboard, 2 chairs angled toward the fire. Elena stood at the far end of the room, alone, beside a painting he'd never seen before. Large canvas, oil, dark colors, a landscape that seemed to be more about light failing than about any specific place. She was wearing a dark dress. Her hair was down. She had her arms folded in front of her, not defensively, just gathered, the posture of someone collecting themselves rather than protecting themselves. She heard him come in but did not turn immediately. He stopped a few feet inside the room. He said nothing. He had prepared words during the drive, and he had nothing left of them. She turned. She looked at him the way you looked at something you had finished grieving but not yet finished understanding. The way you examined a thing that had cost you a great deal, and from which you were trying to extract whatever knowledge was worth keeping. "You came alone," she said. Not warmly, not coldly, observationally. "Yes." "Sit down." He sat. She remained standing. He noticed that and didn't object to it. The fire made a small sound behind its grate. From somewhere deeper in the estate, he could hear the indistinct sounds of the event's final stages, voices, and the movement of people concluding things. "Why are you doing this to me?" he said. He had not intended to lead with it. It came out before the controlled version of the conversation he'd planned could start, which was probably accurate. It was the first thing, the thing underneath all the analysis and the documentation and the weeks of sitting with the shape of it. Elena unfolded her arms. She turned from the painting toward him fully. "You mean, why am I letting the world see who you really are without me protecting you?" The precision of it hit him. Not because it was cruel, she said it without particular edge, but because it was correct. "You ruined me," he said. "No." She moved toward the center of the room, unhurried, stopping a few feet from where he was sitting. "I built you. There's a difference." "I built plenty." "You did," she said. "I'm not taking your intelligence. I'm not taking your work." She looked at him steadily. "But every investor who trusted you trusted my name before they trusted yours. Every opportunity that opened in the past 4 years came through connections I fed you before I stopped feeding them. Every time your company was structurally fragile, which was 3 times, Damien, 3 times you didn't see it coming, I managed the exposure before it reached you." He opened his mouth. "The Kellerman Group," she said, before he could speak. "March, 3 years ago. They were going to pull their commitment. You never knew because Marcus handled it." She paused. "The municipal permitting issue on the Weston deal. That didn't resolve because Brad is good, though he is. It resolved because someone made a call." Another pause. "And the quarter your receivables were so compressed you were 30 days from a covenant breach on your primary credit facility." He stared at her. "You went to a conference in Miami that week," she said. "You came back and the problem had resolved and you thought the CFO had found a solution." She looked at him without cruelty and without satisfaction. "There was no solution. There was a bridge. I funded it through 2 intermediaries and you never knew it happened." The room was very quiet except for the fire. Damien sat with what she had said and felt it arrange itself inside him, each piece finding the space where it fit, and the full picture was not what he would have chosen to see. "You could have told me," he said. His voice was different now. The flatness was gone, something underneath it. Elena's expression moved, finally, shifted slightly from the careful neutrality she had worn since he arrived. Not into anger, into something more complicated. "Which part?" she said. "Should I have told you at the beginning? When you were the man I was in love with who had not yet decided I was decorative." She paused. "Or later, when every time I opened my mouth about business, you redirected the conversation because you wanted to be the one who knew things." Her voice was still quiet, still controlled, but there was something in it now, under the surface. "You never asked me, Damien. Not once in 10 years did you sit across from me and say, 'Tell me about your life before me. Tell me who you married. Tell me what you know.'" She looked at him. "You saw what you wanted to see. You hid it." "I simplified it," she said. "There is a difference. I made it easier for you to be comfortable. I kept things quiet so you could feel like the biggest thing in the room." Her jaw was tight now, just slightly, the first physical tell she'd shown. "I loved you enough to make myself smaller, and you mistook that for the truth." Damien's breathing had changed. He was aware of it. He was pressing his hands down on his thighs to keep them from doing something he couldn't predict. "I said things," he said, "that night." "Yes." "Elena, don't." She stepped back. Not dramatically, just clearly. The kind of step back that closes a door. "Don't apologize for the words. You said them because you believed them. That's the thing you need to sit with." She looked at him with something that took him a moment to identify, because he had expected anger, and this was not anger. "You believed them, Damien. You looked at 10 years of a life we built, and you saw nothing in me worth keeping. That's not a bad moment. That's who you were." He stood up. He did it without planning to, his body finding the position before his mind authorized it. He was standing 3 feet from her, and he could see, this close, what 10 years looked like on her face. Not damage exactly, but something that had been through weather and was different for it. "Was," he said. "You said who I was." She looked at him for a long moment. "Go home, Damien." "I'm not the same. Go home." Her voice was not raised. It was something beyond raised, beyond volume, past performance. It was simply done. "The SEC inquiry will resolve. Brad is good and the exposure is contained, and in 8 months you'll be operational again at a reduced scale, and that scale will be entirely yours. I made sure of that." Something crossed her face that he couldn't read. "Because I still don't want to destroy you. I just stopped wanting to carry you." He stood with that. "And Vanessa," he said. He didn't know why he said it. Some need to understand the full perimeter of what had happened to him. Elena's expression told him, in the fraction of a second before she controlled it, that Vanessa Hale was a chapter with more to it than he currently knew. The fraction of a second was enough. "What about her?" Elena said. "She's connected. Her introductions. Gerald Park." He watched Elena's face. "Was she—" "Go home, Damien." "Elena, go home." She turned away from him, back toward the painting, and the turn was absolute, the full application of a body saying this conversation is over, and he understood that he had been given what was on offer, and that pressing further would not produce more. He stood for a moment in the warm, dim room, with the fire down to its last heat, and the sound of the old house settling around him, and the knowledge that the woman 3 feet away had loved him genuinely and completely, and had, after 10 years of invisible service, looked at him with indifference, and that indifference was earned, and he had nothing to argue against it. He turned toward the door. "Damien." He stopped. He did not turn around. Her voice behind him was quiet. "You were enough. You always were." A pause. "You just never looked at me long enough to know that I thought so." He stood in the doorway for 1 second. Then he walked out. The corridor was empty. The estate was quiet now. The last guests gone, the staff moving through the far halls in the unhurried way of people who had done this many times. He walked toward the secondary entrance, the way he had come, and no one stopped him, and no one spoke to him. And he went through the door and into the cold February night, and the city was all lit up and enormous around him. He sat in his car in the estate's outer drive for 6 minutes without starting the engine. His phone screen lit up. A message from a number he did not immediately recognize. He opened it. 3 sentences. No greeting, no signature, just information. Vanessa Hale has been a Luciano family associate since 2019. She was introduced to your network on instruction. Everything after that was her own choice. He read it 3 times. He looked up through the windshield at the estate gates, already closing in his rearview mirror, the iron moving slowly and with the absolute certainty of something that had been closing against the world for a very long time. He thought about Vanessa at the dinner table, saying, "Figure out who built the architecture of your last 6 months." He thought about Vanessa in October at the party, saying, "I'd love to introduce you to Gerald, he's brilliant." He thought about every conversation he'd had with her that he had believed was between 2 people and now understood had been between 3. He had been alone in this longer than he'd known. He started the car. He drove back into Chicago, and the city received him the way cities received everyone. Without judgment, without recognition, indifferent and lit up and ongoing in all its complexity, 1,000 things happening at once in the dark, and Damian Cross driving through it at midnight with his hands on the wheel and the whole architecture of the life he had believed in dismantled around him, wondering what in God's name he was supposed to build next, and whether he had the material left to build anything at all. Phần 4 sẽ là sự sụp đổ hoàn toàn và cuộc chiến cuối cùng, khi Damian mất tất cả và buộc phải chọn chấp nhận sự thật hay tự hủy hoại mình trong một nỗ lực tuyệt vọng cuối cùng để giành lại thứ anh ta không bao giờ thực sự sở hữu. He drove for 2 hours without going anywhere specific. That was the truth of it. He got on Lakeshore Drive heading north and then turned around somewhere past Evanston and came back south and went past downtown and kept going and eventually found himself parked on a street in Bridgeport, 3 blocks from the house he grew up in, engine off, watching the neighborhood he had spent his entire adult life trying to leave. The houses were small and close together, and most of the lights were off at this hour. A dog barked somewhere down the block and stopped. A car passed and its headlights moved across his windshield and were gone. He sat there for 40 minutes. He thought about Vanessa. He thought about the 3 sentences on his phone screen. Introduced to your network on instruction, everything after that was her own choice. And he turned that language over and over, trying to determine what her own choice meant in the context of a relationship that had begun as an assignment. He thought about her face across various tables over the past year, the particular quality of her attention, the way she asked questions that were more precise than they appeared. He had found her precision attractive. He had interpreted it as intellectual compatibility. He thought, how much of it was real? He didn't have an answer. He suspected he might not get one. He suspected that was part of the design. He started the car and drove to his mother's house and sat outside it for another 10 minutes before he went in. She was asleep. He let himself in with his key and sat in the kitchen in the dark and drank a glass of water from the tap the way he'd done as a teenager after late nights, standing at the sink with the cold water coming out of the old faucet that his mother had been meaning to replace for 15 years and never had. He thought about Elena sitting in this kitchen, bringing rolls from the bakery on Halstead. 2 hours. Not one bad word. He went home before his mother woke up. He left a note on the kitchen table that said, "Came by late, didn't want to wake you. Call me this week. D." He put his key back in the drawer and let himself out and drove back to the apartment as the sky was beginning to go gray. He slept for 3 hours. When he woke up, he called Priya. "I need the full liquidity picture," he said. "Not the managed version, the actual numbers." A pause that lasted slightly too long. "I'll have it to you by noon." 9. Another pause. 9, she said. The numbers arrived at 9:14. Damian sat at the kitchen table in yesterday's shirt and read through them with a cup of coffee, going cold beside him, the way Elena's tea had gone cold on a different table in a different life. The picture was not catastrophic yet. That was the most precise way to describe it. The SEC inquiry had not yet triggered the Whitmore liquidity clause because the principals had not yet formally moved, but their silence was a countdown, and Priya's projections included a scenario column that mapped what happened if the clause triggered in the next 30 days. In that scenario, Cross Capital Ventures survived as a structure, but was reduced to roughly 30% of its current operational capacity. 3 staff positions would need to be eliminated. The 2 acquisition targets currently in due diligence would have to be abandoned. The expansion into the national market that had been the entire architecture of the past 18 months would be deferred by a minimum of 2 years, during which time the competitors who were currently running parallel strategies would consolidate positions that would be very difficult to challenge later. It was not death. It was something that felt, to a man who had organized his entire identity around forward momentum, worse than death. It was being made small again, being sent back, being the Southside kid at the starting line while the people he had briefly been running with accelerated into the distance. He set the report down. He thought for a long time. Then he called a number he had not called in 6 years, a man named Paul Decker, who ran a boutique legal shop that specialized in the kind of aggressive regulatory response that Brad's firm, with its broader client relationships and its need to maintain goodwill with federal agencies, could not pursue without collateral damage. Decker operated differently. Decker was the kind of attorney you called when you had decided that the situation required fighting rather than managing. "Damian Cross," Decker said when he answered. Not surprised. Never surprised. "Heard you had some weather." "I need someone to go after the sourcing of the SEC filing," Damian said. "I believe it was coordinated. I believe there is documentation that would establish the coordination and that the filing was not made in good faith, but as a competitive or personal instrument." Decker was quiet for a moment. "You're talking about going after whoever filed it. I'm talking about establishing that the filing was improper and pursuing whatever remedies attached to that. Who do you think filed it?" Damian looked out the apartment window at the gray March morning. He thought about the answer to that question. He thought about what the answer would require him to do, who it would require him to go against, what the response to that would look like from people who had been operating in Chicago at a level he had only recently glimpsed and still did not fully understand. He thought about Elena's face in the room at the estate. Her voice. "I still don't want to destroy you. I just stopped wanting to carry you." He thought about whether he believed her. He thought about the 3 sentences on his phone. Everything after that was her own choice. "I'll come in Thursday," he said. He hung up and immediately knew it was a mistake, which was the specific knowledge that arrived too late. The body understanding something the mind had already committed to. He sat with that knowledge for a full minute. Then he picked the phone back up. He did not call Decker back. He called Marcus. Marcus answered on the second ring. "Mr. Cross, I need you to tell her something." He stopped. He thought about how to say the thing precisely, because with Marcus imprecision was waste, and waste was disrespect. "Tell her I know where this goes if I push back. Tell her I know what I'm holding, and I know what she's holding, and I know how this ends if both of us decide to use what we have." He paused. "And tell her I don't want that. Tell her I'm asking, not demanding, not negotiating, asking for a conversation." Marcus was quiet long enough that Damian thought the call had dropped. "I'll convey it," Marcus said. "Marcus," he stopped again. "Tell her I'm not the same man I was in that kitchen." A beat. "Mr. Cross," Marcus said, and his voice carried something that was not quite warmth but was not indifference either, something that might have been the professional version of pity. "I've been in this family's service for 31 years. In my experience, the people who most need to say that are the ones who haven't finished becoming it yet." A pause. "But I'll convey it." The call ended. Damian put his phone face down on the table and pressed his palms flat against the surface and breathed. The kitchen was very quiet. The coffee was cold. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in March, persisting, raw, refusing to commit to anything as definitive as spring. The response from Marcus came in 4 hours. Not a call. A time and an address sent as a plain text message. The address was not the estate. It was a building on the upper floors of a Michigan Avenue tower that Damian recognized as the location of a legal firm he had never had occasion to engage. 7 o'clock. He went. The building's upper floors were occupied by offices that had the particular quality of spaces used by people who did not need to advertise their seriousness. No design gestures, no statement furniture, just rooms that were exactly as functional as required, and no more. A woman at a reception desk walked him to a conference room and left without speaking. Elena was not there yet. Salvatore Luciano was. Damian had seen Salvatore Luciano once before, at a distance, at a function 3 years into his marriage that Elena had attended without explaining the significance of everyone present. He had noted the older man, broad, white-haired, the specific gravity of someone accustomed to being the most significant person in any room. And Elena had steered him in a different direction before an introduction could occur, which he had understood at the time as her being protective of his social comfort among people he didn't know. He understood it differently now. Salvatore Luciano sat at the head of the conference table with his hands folded in front of him and looked at Damien Cross with the expression of a man who had known this meeting was coming for a long time and had simply been waiting for the correct moment to allow it. Damien stopped inside the door. "Mr. Cross." Salvatore's voice was lower than he'd expected, and slower. The voice of a man who had learned long ago that speed was for people who were not certain of their authority. "Sit down." Damien sat. He did not speak. He understood with a clarity that arrived from the base of his spine rather than from his thinking brain that he was in a room where the protocols he had used his entire professional life did not apply, and that the correct response to that was to be quiet and present and very, very careful. Salvatore looked at him for a moment without speaking. The look was not hostile. It was the look of a man conducting an assessment, which was somehow more frightening than hostility because it implied that the outcome was still being determined. "My daughter," Salvatore said, "has not asked me to be here tonight." Damien waited. "I am here because there are things that are appropriately said by a father and not by the person who has already said more than she owed." Salvatore unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the table in a gesture that was not aggressive but was very clear. "You called Marcus today and told him you know what you're holding. You used those words." Damien said nothing. "I want to know," Salvatore said, "what you believe you are holding." The room was absolutely quiet. The building's ventilation made a low sound. Somewhere below, 40 floors down, the city moved and didn't know about this room. Damien thought about the folder Brad had put on his desk. He thought about beneficial ownership chains and Luciano-connected entities and the sourcing of the SEC documentation. He thought about what any of it meant in a room with this man. He said, "Nothing." Salvatore looked at him. "I called Marcus because I was afraid," Damien said. "I used that language because I was operating out of fear and I wanted leverage, and I don't have any." He held the older man's gaze. "I don't have anything, and I think you know that." Something shifted in Salvatore's face. Not a smile, something smaller, deeper. "Fear is honest," Salvatore said. "Yes, sir. More honest than most things men bring into rooms like this." He picked up a glass of water from the table and drank from it and set it down. "My daughter built you a house," he said. "You lived in it for 10 years, and you told her she was worth nothing, and you walked out." He looked at Damien without drama. "I want to know why I should permit you to speak with her again." Damien sat with the question. He knew there was a version of this where he tried to construct an argument. His changed perspective, his accountability, the things he'd understood in the months since the kitchen, since the Avalon, since the estate. He knew how to build an argument. He had built arguments professionally for 15 years. He also knew that the man across the table had spent 30 years assessing whether people in difficult positions were being honest or were being strategic, and that in this room, strategy would be visible and would be the end of the conversation. "Because she deserves to decide that herself," Damien said. "Not you." The silence lasted 6 seconds. Salvatore looked at him across the length of the conference table, and the 6 seconds were the longest Damien could remember enduring. Then Salvatore stood. He buttoned his jacket. A single button, an old suit, the gesture of a man for whom dressing was habit rather than performance. He looked at Damien one more time with the assessment that had not fully completed and might not ever fully complete. "She'll be here in 10 minutes, he said. He moved toward the door. "Whatever you have to say it once. Clearly." He paused at the door without turning around. "She's not the girl who sat in your kitchen anymore. Keep that in mind." He left. Damien sat alone at the conference room, and his heart was doing something unpleasant in his chest, a speed and irregularity that he had not felt since a car accident at 24 that he'd walked away from with bruised ribs and a changed relationship to his own mortality. He pressed both hands flat on the table. He breathed. He looked at the far wall and went through once more what he intended to say. He had 3 things. He had decided on 3 things during the drive over, had reduced everything down to its essential components, the way he reduced everything that mattered, cutting until what remained was only what could not be cut. 1. What he had done. 2, what he understood now that he had not understood then. 3, what he was asking for. He was not asking for the marriage back. He was not asking for the protection or the architecture or the infrastructure. He was asking for the chance to demonstrate, over whatever time she required, that the man she'd married had not been the whole story of who he was, that there was a version of Damian Cross who could look at a person and see them accurately, and that person was available and present and had driven around Chicago for 2 hours at midnight, confronting the full weight of his failures before arriving, finally, here. That was the ask. It was not a business proposal. It was not a negotiation. He knew it might not be enough. He sat in the conference room and he knew with the honesty of a man who had recently been forced into extensive contact with his own limitations that it might be too late, might have been too late from the moment the words left his mouth in that kitchen, that certain damage was past remediation regardless of the quality of the regret that followed it. He knew that. He was here anyway. The door opened. Elena came in alone. No Thomas, no men in tailored suits, no structural indication of the network that moved when she moved. Just her. Dark coat, the same bracelet she always wore, her hair down. She closed the door behind her and did not immediately approach the table. She stood for a moment with her hand still on the door and looked at him with an expression that was the most unguarded he had seen on her face since before the kitchen, since before the slow years of careful small-making, since something earlier than he could precisely locate. She was tired. He saw that. Not a personal tired. Not the tired of a bad week or a long day. The tired of someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had set it down recently and was still adjusting to the absence of the weight. "My father talked to you," she said. "Yes." "What did he say?" "He asked what I was holding." Damien looked at her. "I told him nothing." Something in her face shifted. She came to the table. She did not sit at the far end. She sat 2 chairs away from him, close enough that the conversation could be quiet, and folded her hands on the table and looked at him with the particular focus of someone who had decided to give this exactly as much as it deserved and no more. "Say what you came to say," she said. He said it. He said all 3 things, in the order he had organized them, without embellishment and without the protective cushioning of qualifications. He said what he had done. Not constructed regret, but specific accounting. The dinner he walked out of, the words, the decade of not asking, the fundamental failure of curiosity about the person he slept beside for 10 years. He said what he understood now, and then he said what he was asking for, clearly, in the terms he had decided on in the car. She listened. She did not interrupt. She did not look away. She listened the way she did everything, fully, without performance, with the absolute attention of someone for whom partial engagement was not a mode. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "You went to Decker," she said. He had not mentioned Decker. The fact that she knew he had called Decker, known it quickly enough to reference it here, tonight, within hours, told him things about the network he was still only partially grasping. "I did," he said. "And then you called Marcus." "Yes." "Why did you call Marcus instead of following through with Decker?" He thought about the honest answer. "Because following through with Decker would have been using what happened to us as ammunition, and I don't want to use it as ammunition." He looked at her. "I want to understand it." Elena looked at him for a long time. Outside, the city pressed against the building's glass in its ongoing, unconcerned way. 40 floors of silence between this room and the street. "The SEC inquiry will resolve," she said. Her voice was neutral, informational. "Within 60 days, the supporting documentation will be found to be insufficient for a formal investigation. You'll receive a letter and it's done." She paused. "The Whitmore principles will not trigger the liquidity clause. They'll express concern, and then they'll stay." She looked at her hands, then back at him. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I built the structure and it's not clean to leave it damaged." "Elena, let me finish." She was not sharp about it, just precise. "You're going to rebuild, on your own, without what I was feeding you. It will be slower. Some doors will stay closed, that's honest. You should be working from your own leverage, not mine." Something in her expression moved carefully. "You're smart enough to do it. You always were." "That's not why I came," he said. "I know why you came." "Then tell me what you think." She was quiet for a moment. The particular quality of her silence was different in this room than it had been in the kitchen 14 months ago. Then it had been a woman choosing not to respond to something that had hurt her. Now it was a woman deciding how much of something real she was willing to give to a room with a specific history. "I think," she said slowly, "that you are someone who had to lose everything to learn to look." She paused. "And I think that might be who you've always been. Someone who learns through loss." Her voice was without judgment. It was an observation, genuinely analytical, and that somehow made it more painful than accusation would have been. "The question is what you do with the learning." He leaned forward slightly. "What would it take?" She looked at him. "To believe it," he said. "To consider, not decide, just consider, that the man who came to this room is not the same man who was in that kitchen. What would it take for you to consider that?" Elena looked at him for a long time. The fire was not in her eyes. It was something quieter and more dangerous than fire. Something that had moved past the burning stage into the stage where the temperature was constant and did not require fuel. She opened her mouth to speak. The conference room door opened. Thomas stood in the doorway with a face that Damien had never seen on him in the brief encounters of the past months. A face that had broken through the professional neutrality into something raw and specific and alarming. "Miss Elena." Thomas's voice was controlled with visible effort. "Your father." Elena was out of her chair before he finished the sentence, the coat sleeve catching the table edge and pulling a water glass that hit the floor and shattered as she moved through the door. And Damien was standing with the broken glass and the unfinished sentence and the sound of her footsteps going fast down the corridor toward whatever Thomas's face had meant. And the door swung slowly back on its hinge and the conference room went quiet, and the city pressed against the glass 40 floors below and did not stop for any of it. He stood alone in the room for 5 seconds. Then he followed her. Phần 5, phần cuối, sẽ là kết thúc của tất cả. Sự mất mát, sự kế thừa và câu trả lời cuối cùng cho câu hỏi Damien đã hỏi trong căn phòng đó. Một câu trả lời không đến bằng lời nói. The corridor was long and lit with the particular flatness of office building lighting at night. Every surface the same pale gray, the kind of illumination that made everything look like it was already being documented. Damien followed the sound of Elena's footsteps and found her at the elevator bank with Thomas beside her, his hand pressing the button repeatedly in the way people pressed buttons when they understood that pressing them repeatedly accomplished nothing but couldn't stop. "What happened?" Elena said. Not a question. A demand for information delivered in the voice of someone already managing the emotional response to an answer they hadn't received yet. "He collapsed in the car," Thomas said, "on the way back from the estate. Gio called from the hospital. Northwestern Memorial, they took him straight to..." Elena was already moving toward the stairwell door because the elevator hadn't come. Damien stood at the elevator bank and watched the stairwell door swing shut behind her and Thomas, and he stood there for 3 seconds with his hand not quite touching the door and made the calculation that was not really a calculation because the answer was already determined by something below the level of reasoning. He followed. The stairwell echoed their descent, 40 floors compressing into the kind of urgency that made the body forget it was tired. He came out into the lobby 2 floors behind them and saw Elena moving through the revolving doors into the Michigan Avenue night, Thomas already at the curb with his phone at his ear, calling for the car, and the city outside was ordinary and indifferent and ongoing in all its complexity. And Elena stood on the sidewalk in the March cold, with her coat half buttoned and her face doing something he had not seen it do in all the years he had known her. She was afraid. Not the careful, managed fear of someone who had learned to process difficulty through structure and discipline. Something older than that, something that bypassed all the years of cultivated control and went straight to the place where she was still someone's daughter. The car came in 4 minutes. She got in. Thomas got in. The door closed. Damien stood on the sidewalk and watched the car pull into traffic and merge with the nighttime stream of Michigan Avenue and disappear, and he stood there in the cold with his hands in his coat pockets and thought about what he was doing and what he was not doing. He hailed a cab. Northwestern Memorial's emergency entrance was lit up against the dark, the way hospitals were always lit against the dark, aggressively, as if sufficient brightness could hold back the thing that brought people there. Damien came through the doors and found the waiting area and scanned it and found a corner where Thomas was standing with his phone and an expression that was professional on the surface and fractured underneath. Thomas looked at him when he came in. Damien said nothing. He just stood there, which was its own kind of statement, and after a moment Thomas looked away without asking him to leave. He sat in a chair against the wall and he waited. He did not know how long. Hospitals restructured time the way airports did. Removed the normal markers, replaced them with a different system in which the only meaningful unit was the distance between now and the piece of information you were waiting for. He sat and he thought about Salvatore Luciano's face across the conference table earlier tonight. The particular weight of the man, the way he had stood and buttoned his jacket and said, "She's not the girl who sat in your kitchen anymore," with the matter-of-fact quality of someone delivering a fact rather than a warning. He thought about the way Elena had moved when Thomas appeared in the doorway. The coat sleeve catching the table, the water glass, the sound of it hitting the floor. The way she had been through the door before the glass stopped moving. He thought about 31 years of service. He thought about Thomas pressing an elevator button with the specific helplessness of a man who would take any action available to him, regardless of its effectiveness. He thought about what it meant to love a person the way these people loved Salvatore Luciano, with the totality of people whose lives had been organized around a center of gravity for so long that the removal of that center was not an abstract loss but a structural one, the kind that changed the physical shape of every day. He understood something sitting in that waiting room chair. He understood it not as information, but as a felt thing, the kind of knowledge that sits differently in the body than knowledge that arrives through reasoning. He understood that he had been the recipient for 10 years of exactly this quality of commitment from exactly one person, and he had not known it was happening, and not knowing it was happening had not changed what it cost her. Elena came out of the corridor at 11:40. She stopped when she saw him. A brief stop, a fraction of a second, and then she continued toward Thomas and spoke to him in a low voice, and Thomas nodded and moved away to make a call. She stood in the waiting area with her arms folded and her face reconstituted into the careful arrangement of someone who had been crying in private and had spent 5 minutes in a hospital bathroom rebuilding the surface before coming back out. He could still see it, the redness at the edges of her eyes, the slight tension in her jaw that was the residue of held breath. He stood up. "How is he?" he said. She looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating, processing that he was here, deciding what that meant, determining the response. "Stable," she said. "For now." Her voice was flat with the specific flatness of someone managing information that was not yet resolved. "They think it was cardiac. They're running tests." "Elena, why are you here, Damien?" He looked at her. "Because you ran out of the room, and I followed." "That's not a reason." "It's the only one I have." She looked at him for a moment, and her eyes were doing something that he couldn't fully read, some complex processing that moved through several things in rapid succession, fatigue and old pain and the immediate distress of the night, and underneath all of it something else. Something that was maybe the question of whether a person could be surprised, after everything, by another person's capacity for a thing as simple as showing up. She turned away from him and went to a chair and sat down and pressed her fingers against her eyes briefly, and then dropped her hands to her lap. He sat down. Not close. 2 chairs away, close enough for conversation, far enough to leave her the space. They sat in the waiting room of Northwestern Memorial and didn't speak for a while, and the hospital did what hospitals did around them, moved, beeped, announced things over intercoms, conducted the ordinary operations of a place designed to manage the worst nights of people's lives, and neither of them commented on any of it. After a while she said, "He knew." Damien waited. He knew tonight might be. He knew his heart had been an issue for 2 years. His doctors knew. Thomas knew. She was looking at the floor. "I knew." A pause. "He didn't tell me how close it was because he didn't want me to come back for the wrong reason." Damien was quiet. "He wanted me to come back because I was ready," she said, "not because I was scared." She looked up from the floor, at the far wall. "He's been running the business from a diminished position for 8 months, covering it, making sure the operations were intact so that when I stepped in, I wouldn't be inheriting damage." Something moved in her throat. 81 men and women in his organization whose livelihoods depend on a transition that goes cleanly. He's been planning it for 2 years. Her voice remained even, barely, by himself. He was protecting you, Damien said. He was always protecting me. She said it without sentiment, which made it heavier than sentiment would have. That's what he does. That's what he did for 31 years while I was growing up inside those walls, and then for 10 years while I was outside them. She stopped. I used to think the protection was the problem. That's why I left. I wanted to be a person without the wall around me. A pause. Then I built my own walls, different materials, same function. He thought about the sweatshirt, the kitchen, the cold tea. The veil name, he said. She looked at him. That's why. The name you gave me. It wasn't just cover. He said it carefully, working it out as he spoke. You were trying to live outside the wall. She looked at him for a moment that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. I was trying to be a person who was loved for exactly what was in the room, she said, not for what stood behind me. And you got that. I got a version of it. Elena, you loved me, she said. Not sharply, just clearly, the way she said everything that mattered. I know you did. I'm not revising that. I'm saying the version of me you loved was incomplete, because I never showed you the whole thing, and eventually the incomplete version wasn't enough for you, and you didn't have the rest of me to fall back on because you didn't know it existed. She looked at her hands. That's not only your failure, that's mine too. The admission landed in the room between them, and he sat with it, the weight of it, the particular kind of relief that came from someone giving you credit for exactly half the damage and no more. What happens now? He said. With the business. Her expression shifted into something that was not quite grief and not quite resolution, but occupied the space between them. I take it, she said, formally, which I should have done a year ago, which he should have asked me to do a year ago, which neither of us did because we were both managing our feelings about what it meant. She pressed her lips together briefly. It means I'm Salvatore Luciano's daughter, publicly. Not just in rooms where people already know. It means I stop operating from behind glass, and I step into the thing I was always going to step into. Are you afraid? She considered the question with real attention rather than deflecting it. Of the work? No. She looked at him. Of becoming my father? A little. A pause. He's a good man. A genuinely good man who made choices over 30 years that I would not make and that I will not make. The business will change under me. The structure will change. She said it with the quiet certainty of someone who had already run the calculations. But the people who depend on it will be protected. That doesn't change. He thought about the men with tailored suits and scarred faces at the Avalon. He thought about Thomas pressing the elevator button with both hands. He thought about Marcus saying 31 years with the weight of someone describing a country rather than a job. You know how to lead them, he said. I've been leading them for a year, she said, just not with my name on it. It was said without pride, matter-of-factly, and he heard in it the echo of something he had spent months trying to understand. The difference between performing authority and simply having it, the distinction between a person who needed the room to acknowledge them and a person who could function completely regardless of whether the room understood what was in front of it. He had spent his professional life trying to become the former. She had always been the latter. A doctor came out from the corridor at 12:30 and spoke to Elena for 4 minutes, while Damien sat at a distance and watched her face receive the information. The doctor left. Elena stood for a moment with her hand flat against her sternum, a gesture so brief and private he almost didn't see it, and then she turned. He's going to need surgery, she said. Not tonight, in the next week, scheduled. She came back toward the chairs. It's manageable. They're saying the prognosis is good if the surgery goes well. She sat down. Thomas is calling the family lawyer and the accountant. There are things that need to be documented before... She stopped, pressed her fingers against her eyes again. Before the surgery, just in case. I can go, he said. She looked at him. If you need the space, he said, I can go. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with the expression he had not been able to read in the kitchen on the worst night and had spent months trying to understand and was only now beginning to have the vocabulary for. It was not warmth exactly, not yet, maybe not for a long time, but it was the look of someone who had stopped keeping the door fully closed and had not yet determined how far open it was willing to go, and in the context of everything that had preceded it, in the context of 14 months of reckoning and a waiting room at midnight and a water glass broken on a conference room floor, it was enough to be going on with. "Stay," she said, "for a while." He stayed. They sat until 2 in the morning when the immediate medical picture had stabilized enough for Elena to agree to go home to the estate with Thomas. Damien walked with them to the exit and stood at the hospital doors while Thomas brought the car around and Elena stood beside him in the cold with her coat finally fully buttoned against the March air. She didn't say anything and he didn't say anything, and the city was doing what it always did, which was everything at once, and none of it specifically for either of them. The car came. She turned toward it, and then she stopped and turned back and looked at him with the directness that had always been the thing about her that cut cleanest, the thing he had spent a decade not fully looking at and was looking at now. "The question you asked me," she said, "in the conference room, before Thomas came in." He waited. "I don't have an answer yet," she said. "I want you to understand that. I'm not holding it back. I genuinely don't have it." She held his gaze. "But I'm not closed to having it eventually. That's different than where I was 6 months ago." He nodded. He did not push. He understood. Standing on the sidewalk outside Northwestern Memorial at 2 in the morning with the lake somewhere to the east and the city going on forever in every direction, that the only response to what she'd just given him was to receive it as what it was, rather than as a beginning of something he could accelerate. She got in the car. The car pulled out. He stood on the sidewalk until the taillights were gone. Then he turned up his collar against the wind and walked east toward the lake because he needed to walk and there was nowhere specific to go, and the lake was at least a thing you could stand in front of that was larger than the situation you were carrying. He walked for 40 minutes. He came to the lakefront and stood on the path above the water, and the lake was black and enormous, and made its low sound, the same sound it had been making since before the city existed, and would make after it was gone. And he stood there until the cold reached the place in his chest where the heat of the evening's events was still banked, and then he turned around and walked back into the city. He went home. He slept 4 hours. He woke up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and the company financials, and he began the work. Not the managed version, not the version that waited for external resolution or outside support or the invisible architecture of someone else's protection. He opened the actual documents and looked at the actual numbers and began, for the first time in years perhaps, to build something from the material he actually had. It was slower than what he was used to. The SEC inquiry resolved 53 days later. A letter arrived confirming that the commission had reviewed the supporting documentation and found it insufficient to proceed with a formal investigation. Cross Capital Ventures was cleared. Priya sent him the letter via email and then called to tell him about it, and he could hear in her voice the relief of someone who had been carrying contingency plans for 2 months. "We're okay," she said. "We're smaller than we were," he said. "We're intact." "Yes," he said. "We're intact." The Whitmore principals stayed. Gerald Park called him, personally, as he had done when the deal closed, and the tone of the call was different now. Not the warmth of a man executing an instruction, but something more careful, more equivocal, the tone of a man who was operating on less clear guidance than he had been previously and was managing the ambiguity. Damien received the call and was professional and gave nothing away. And when he hung up, he sat for a moment thinking about what the call's change quality meant about what was happening or not happening, and decisions that were being made at a level he still only partially saw. He did not contact Elena. He had made a decision about that, had made it on the lakefront at 2 in the morning and had not revised it in the weeks since. She had said she didn't have an answer yet. He believed her. He understood. In the way he was slowly understanding things that required patience rather than force, that the answer would come when it came, and that engineering its arrival would destroy the possibility of it being real. He rebuilt. It was genuinely harder than it had been before. Doors that had opened easily were now slow. Investors who had returned calls within the hour now took days. He worked for it in a way he had not worked since the first years, the years before the invisible infrastructure had made things artificially smooth. And the working for it had a quality of honesty that the smoother years had lacked. He thought about that sometimes, about the paradox of having been better supported and less real versus harder and more his own. About what his mother's house in Bridgeport felt like when he visited compared to what the penthouse on the 42nd floor had felt like when he lived there. About the difference between a life you built and a life that was built for you by someone who loved you more than you deserved at the time. Salvatore Luciano had his surgery on a Thursday in late April. Damien knew because Marcus sent him a one-line message that morning. Mr. Luciano is in surgery today. He sat with the message for a long time. Then he sent back, "Thank you for telling me." He did not expect a response and did not receive one, and he went to work and spent the day being the person his company needed him to be, and thought about an old man in a surgical suite and his daughter somewhere in a hospital waiting room with her hands in her lap and her mother's bracelet on her wrist. The surgery went well. He knew this because 2 days later, Elena called him. He was at his desk when the phone rang, her name on the screen. He looked at it for one full ring before answering. "He's okay," she said. "I wanted you to know." "I'm glad," he said. He meant it completely, and the completeness of it surprised him slightly. The absence of ambivalence, the clean quality of the relief. A pause on the line. "How's the company?" she said. "Working," he said. "Honestly working. It's slower." "Slower is sustainable." "Yes," he said. "I'm learning that." Another pause. The line had the particular quality of two people deciding whether to go further or stop. "He asked about you," she said. "My father." After the surgery, when he was clear enough to have a conversation. A pause. "He wanted to know if you were still in the city." Damien was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were still in the city and that you were doing honest work and that what happened next was not decided yet." She paused. "He said that was fair. Is that what you think?" "It's what I said." Her voice was careful but not closed. "I think things that are not decided yet are not decided yet. I've learned to let them be that." He thought about patience, about the long game, about where he had learned both of those things and from whom. "Elena," he said. "Don't," she said, gently, not sharply. "Not on the phone. Not today." A pause. "I'm tired today. It's been a long few weeks." "I know." "But—" She stopped. He heard her breathe. One breath, in and out, the sound of someone deciding something. "There's a dinner at the estate next month. My father wants to eat outside when the weather turns. He wants the table on the terrace." Another pause. "Thomas will call you with the date." He sat very still at his desk. "Okay," he said. "It's dinner," she said. "I want you to understand that. It's not a resolution or a conclusion. It's dinner." "I understand." "And you'll behave yourself." Something moved in his chest that was the first genuinely light thing he had felt in a long time. "I'll behave myself," he said. She hung up. He sat with his phone on the desk and the city outside his office windows and the company running its quiet operations around him, and thought about a table on a terrace in May, the lake visible from the Luciano estate on a clear evening, and an old man who had looked across a conference table and said, "Fear is honest," and had meant it as the beginning of something rather than its end. The month passed. Damien worked. He made progress that was his own, earned in the ways things were earned without assistance, and the progress was less spectacular than the years before it and more solid, the kind of foundation you could stand on without checking whether the ground belonged to you. Thomas called on a Thursday with a date in the second week of May. Damien wrote it down. He arrived at the estate at 7 on the evening Thomas had specified, driving himself, parking on the outer drive. The gates opened without him having to announce himself, which was the first thing that felt different from every other arrival. The absence of the gate as test, the simple opening of it. Gio was at the inner door. He looked at Damien with the assessment of a man who had been making assessments of people in relation to Elena Luciano for a long time and had strong views. "Mr. Cross," he said. "Neutral. A held verdict." "Gio," Damien said. Gio held the door. The estate in May was different from the estate in the winter months. The garden was open and green, the old trees in full leaf, the terrace visible through the house with a table set for 3, and the lake catching the last of the evening light in the distance beyond the lawn. The air smelled like cut grass and the particular clean cold that came off the lake even in warm weather. Salvatore Luciano was already on the terrace. He was seated, thinner than he had been at the conference table 2 months ago, the surgery visible in the economy of his movements, but upright and present and wearing a jacket and drinking water with the quiet confidence of a man who had decided that the life he had was worth the adjustments required to continue it. He looked at Damien when he came through the terrace doors and the assessment was still there. The same reading quality it had always had, but something in it had shifted from active evaluation to something that had arrived at a provisional position and was watching to see if the position held. "Damien Cross," he said. "Mr. Luciano." Damien stopped at the edge of the table. "I'm glad you're well." Salvatore looked at him for a moment. "Sit down," he said. Damien sat. They were alone on the terrace. The third setting at the table was empty. The evening moved around them. The lake sound, the birds, the particular quality of a May evening in the upper Midwest that carried in it everything that had been survived to get here, winter and cold, and the long persistence of difficult months. "She'll be a few minutes," Salvatore said. "She's finishing a call." He poured water into Damien's glass from the pitcher on the table, a gesture so ordinary and domestic coming from a man of his particular history that it landed as something almost ceremonial. "She's running 2 restructuring processes simultaneously," he said. "In addition to the ongoing operations, she doesn't sleep enough." "No," Damien said. "She never did." Salvatore looked at him with slight surprise, and then something that was perhaps the closest he came to approval, the recognition that Damien had known this thing about his daughter, had known it specifically, had paid attention to the small true details of her. "She's going to change things," Salvatore said. He said it without regret or complication. "The way it runs, the boundaries of it. Some of what I built she'll keep. Other parts—" He paused. "She'll do it better. I've known that for a long time." "Does that bother you?" Salvatore considered the question with genuine attention. "No," he said finally. "I built it to outlast me. If it outlasts me in a different form, it still outlasted me." He picked up his water glass. "A man who can only be proud of what was built exactly to his own specifications is a man who doesn't understand what building is for." Damien sat with that. The terrace door opened. Elena came out carrying nothing, not her phone, not a jacket, just herself, in a dark blue dress, her hair down, the bracelet. She moved across the terrace toward the table, and she looked at her father first, with the quick, specific check of someone who is still monitoring recovery. And he answered it with a small, impatient gesture that clearly meant, "I'm fine, stop checking." And she absorbed this with the expression of someone who would continue checking regardless, and had accepted that this was now simply part of how they were. Then she looked at Damien. He stood. She stopped on the other side of the table, and they looked at each other across it. This man and this woman, and the 14 months and the 10 years and the kitchen and the gala and the conference room and the hospital corridor and the lake at 2 a.m, all of it present in the space between them without any of it needing to be named. She sat down. He sat down. Salvatore poured wine and said nothing. Rosa appeared with the first course and set it down and disappeared, and the evening moved on to the terrace in its May way, and the lake held its light as long as it could before letting it go. And the 3 of them ate, and the conversation was mostly ordinary. The company, the restructuring, a piece of legislation moving through the city council that had implications for certain real estate interests. And underneath the ordinary conversation was the thing that didn't need to be said because they were sitting at the same table, and the table on the terrace was not nothing. Near the end of the meal, Salvatore said he was tired and rose with the careful economy of a man managing a recovering body, and said goodnight and walked inside, and his hand rested briefly on Elena's shoulder as he passed, and she put her hand over his for a moment before he moved on. Damien and Elena sat on the terrace with the lake going dark beyond the lawn, and the candles on the table burning in the still air, and the remains of dinner between them. After a while she said, "You've been doing honest work." "Yes." "I know, I check." She said it without apology. "Occasionally," he almost smiled. "I figured." "The Harrington Club called you last week," she said. "Through normal channels, not Gerald." "Yes." "That's yours," she said. "That one's actually yours." He looked at her across the table. "I know which ones are mine now," he said. "I've been learning the difference." She looked at him for a moment, with the directness that had always been the true signature of her, The thing underneath all the quiet, and the careful management, and the years of making herself small. "I know you have," she said. The candles moved slightly in a breath of air from the lake, the flame bending and recovering, and the city was lit up beyond the estate walls in its ongoing, complicated way. And Elena Luciano sat at the table her father had asked for on the terrace and looked at the man she had loved and stopped carrying, and was slowly, with the caution of someone who had paid real prices for her own misjudgments, beginning to look at again. Not with the love she'd had in the beginning. That was gone. That specific version of it, the love of a younger woman for a man she believed was showing her all of himself. But there was something else available, something that the years and the losses and the specific honesty of very difficult conversations had made possible. Something that was not innocent, but was real in the way that only things earned through genuine damage could be real. She did not name it, not that night, but she stayed at the table. And he stayed at the table. And the lake was there doing what it had always done, and the city was behind the walls, and the candles burned down slowly, and the night moved in over the water, and neither of them reached for anything more than what the evening was already giving them, which was enough. Which was, finally, enough.